In this video, I want to talk about fitness, what we call fitness components, and different types of traits. So fitness, there's often a lot of subtle variations in how different authors define fitness. They have different ways of phrasing it or different ways of focusing on it. For example, the Sadava textbook defines fitness as the reproductive contribution of a phenotype to subsequent generations relative to the contribution of other phenotypes. That is what fitness is. So it's the contribution, the reproductive contribution, the production of offspring by one phenotype relative to the other phenotypes. Often, fitness is very difficult to measure. It can be very hard in practice to determine the genetic contribution of a phenotype relative to the others. So usually ecologists and evolutionary biologists use what we call fitness components. And these are different aspects of an organism's biology which play a key part in contributing genes to the next generation, but we'd call them a proxy. They're just a way of estimating, or we believe they're correlated with fitness. So this can be a simple one as just surviving to being old enough to reproduce. The only way you can pass your genes on into the future is that you survive. Also, the number of offspring you produce. The more offspring you produce, the more opportunities you have to push genes into the future generations. However, those offspring themselves have to survive long enough to reproduce. Also, offspring quality is another fitness component. If you produce big fat babies, if you're a mammal, that's generally a good thing. Those are babies that are most likely to survive their vulnerable childhood and go on and pass your genes through them on into the future. So each one of these is a fitness component. For plants, we often use things as fitness components like plant size, number of flowers, number of seeds produced. Ideally, though, if you're studying a plant, you would follow all those seeds until they are germinate, until they grow into plants themselves, if you really wanted to know whether the genes in the plants travel into the future. So again, in order to contribute to subsequent generations, you need to survive to reproduce. If you die before you reproduce, your fitness is 0. You need to produce offspring. It doesn't matter how long you survive. If you're a human, you can survive to be 100 years old. But if you don't produce any offspring, your fitness is 0. And you need to produce offspring that are strong enough to survive themselves to reproduction. So if all of your offspring die shortly after being born, then your fitness is 0. So far, me personally, I'm doing pretty well. I have survived long enough to reproduce. I have 3 children, so I've actually produced children. And then so far, my children are doing pretty good. They are nice and healthy. However, my wife sometimes jokes that she wants our children to go off and be priests or nuns. So if that happens, if all 3 of my children become priests and or nuns, then my fitness will still end up being 0, despite the fact that I lived old enough to be reproduced. I produced offspring and my offspring were healthy. So a full accounting of fitness is difficult. The only way I can really know what my fitness is to know if my children produce grandbabies for me. Fortunately, as said already, it's often very difficult to do that process. So most biologists would be happy to simply know that I have 3 children, and they would use that to estimate my fitness. So often we're interested in the relationship between different traits of an organism and their fitness, because traits that are associated with fitness will increase in future generations. So phenotypic traits, we can consider them to be qualitative or discrete. I prefer the term discrete or quantitative or numeric. I'll usually refer to discrete traits and quantitative traits. So a discrete trait, they fall into separate categories. That could be eye color, the ability to wiggle the ears, whether you're lactose tolerant or intolerant or not, whether you have sickle cell anemia or not. Those are discrete traits. Those are basically all yes or no, have or don't have. Quantitative traits are traits that can be measured, at least in theory, numerically. They can be measured or they can be counted. So that includes things like height, weight, pigment density of the skin, melanin density in the skin, blood pressure, ability to store oxygen in the blood. Those are all quantitative traits that can be measured numerically. So these two groups, discrete traits and quantitative traits. Discrete traits, it's not always true, but they often can be determined by alleles at a single locus. That's a way of saying they follow Mendelian genetics. So the traits that Mendel studied in his peas were basically all discrete traits, crinkly or non-crinkly, yellow or green, and tall or short. Those are all discrete traits in those peas. Quantitative traits are usually much messier. Quantitative trait like skin pigmentation can be determined by, in case of skin pigmentation, 20 some odd genes. Other traits, we have sometimes dozens or hundreds of genes that we believe are associated with them. So quantitative traits can be a little messier to study.